Michelle Lizet Flores is a graduate of the FSU and NYU creative writing programs. She currently works as a creative writing instructor at Douglas Anderson School of the Arts, and she co-hosts the What's in a Verse Poetry Open Mic at Rain Dogs. Her publications include the NCTE English Journal, Salt Hill Journal, and the Talon Review. A finalist for the Juan Felipe Herrera Award for Poetry, she wrote the chapbooks Cuentos from the Swamp, Memoria, and the picture book Carlito the Bat Learns to Trick or Treat. Her short fiction is in the anthology Places We Build in the Universe, and Invasive Species, her first full-length collection of poetry, is currently available from Finishing Line Press and available to pre-order here. So Michelle will be joined in conversation with another local poet, Jessica Stark. So Jessica is the author of Buffalo Girls, a finalist for the 2023 Maya Angelou Book Award, Savage Pageants, and four poetry chapbooks, including INNANET. Her poetry has most recently appeared in Best American Poetry, Pleaides, among other literary journals. She's a poetry editor at AGNI and is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of North Florida. She co-organizes the Dreamboat Reading Series here in Jacksonville, Florida. So Jessica, I will leave the rest to you.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for having us. I am so excited to celebrate and to speak with Michelle this afternoon. In celebration, too, of Invasive Species, which just officially launched on February 16th. Mm-hmm. If you ordered it, it should be shipping within the next 2 weeks. If you haven't, I really encourage you to support a local author. So we're going to jump right into it. Most of these questions are actually based around invasive species. I had the privilege of reading this book. It's stunning. It's beautiful. Please go out and get it. It's just, it's gorgeous, and it's incredibly relevant to the landscape that surrounds us in terms of, there's a lot of interesting ties to the land in Florida, to thinking about invasiveness, specifically to a Cuban American and Floridian. So I'm just jumping right into it. Michelle.
Yes.
In terms of invasive species, what is the genesis of this book and its story? When did you know you were writing a book? How long did it take you to write?
Ooh, this is a doozy because this book was a journey. I would say it started as my master's thesis when I was at NYU. Back then it was called Mother City, which is not a great title, but it was a book I was writing while I was living away from Florida for the first time in my life. And my mother was also dealing with a sickness. She was diagnosed with brain cancer at the time. And so I was sort of conceptualizing what it meant to be separate from home, both in terms of person and place. And then she passed while I was at NYU. So I stopped writing for about 5 years after that took place. I moved around a lot, lived in a few different states. Then I came back to Florida, and my first hurricane in like 6 or 7 years, Hurricane Matthew happened. And the poems just started pouring out of me again, which was very unexpected because I thought that chapter of my life was done. And I was just a teacher and just a mom, and that's all I wanted to be. And so from there, I believe Hurricane Matthew was like 2015, 2016. I looked down at all these poems I had written since moving back to Florida, and I realized, oh, there's a book here. I don't know how this happened, but I've got 80 or 90 poems. I don't know if they're any good, but they're here. And so I sort of started cobbling them together, which is, if you've ever followed poets on any kind of social media, you've probably seen them like tape their poems to walls or scatter them across the floor and just sort of visualize what everything needs to look like. And so I started doing that, and late in the nights, like 2 a.m, 3 a.m, can't sleep. Just this book is like calling out to me. And then it was by 2018, I think, I realized there's some kind of manuscript here. So I put it together, started sending it out just to see what would happen. I got rejected many times, met with another local Cuban poet, Andres Rojas, and he helped me sort of figure out what the manuscript was, suggested reordering things, gave me feedback on a lot of poems. And then from there, I sort of cut it down into my first chapbook, Cuentos from the Swamp. Kept reworking some poems, and then eventually it just became what it is now.
And since this is fresh off the press, I hope you won't mind in providing us just a reading of maybe one or two poems.
Sure. So I have a series of poems called Florida Gothic, and a shameless plug, if you are interested in writing Gothic poetry, next Sunday with Femfire Books, I will be leading a Gothic poetry workshop. But this is one of the most recent poems I've written in that series, and it's called Florida Gothic number 7, After the Hurricane. It's a verifiable fact that whiskey tastes best when you drink it on your porch while staring at an orange sky. Hurricane winds bluster through giant oak trees and Spanish moss. You wrap yourself in a tattered blanket, the last gift your mother gave you before she forgot your face. Power lines bounce in the wind, the September air finally giving hints of a season that never quite takes hold. You pull her fleece around your shoulders. Cars, brave enough to traverse the flooded streets, veer slowly past felled branches and scattered pieces of home. Half the state is underwater, the other half is out of power, but you keep sipping your whiskey, keep smoking your menthols, keep staring duende in the face. On nights like these, the humid air finally gives way to the promise of a future where you can start again. But then you remember that you live in Florida, where there are only 2 seasons, before and after the storm. Here, nothing lasts forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just your reading of that actually made me think about how this book is ordered. So there's kind of chapters. There's a before, a during, and after, and the last chapter is titled Rebirth. And I'd love you to speak a little bit about that sequencing, how you decided to organize it in that way. And do you find it sort of like a coming of age reflection of you or the speaker? If you could speak to any of that, that would be great.
I do. I view my life in sort of halves. I call it before hurricane season and after hurricane season. So that's sort of where conceptually the order of the book came from. Hurricane season refers to the time in my life while my mother was dealing with her illness and she passed. And I feel like I am 2 very different people. There's the me that was when she was alive and the me now. And so the book is ordered in that way. And so it starts off as this sort of historical matrilineal lineage of my family in Cuba, coming to the US, all of the pain and hardship, but also beauty that my family has experienced. And then just grappling with mortality in a way that happens once you experience your parents dying. And this is sort of something I've talked about in a different poem, but this is the order of things, right? Children are supposed to bury their parents. You're supposed to take care of them in their age, but that process is still incredibly challenging. And I experienced it in my early 20s. So it was at this very strange time when my life is just starting, really, and I don't get to share that with the person that I am most close to. And so after she passed, I sort of had to grapple with who am I really when I am not connected to someone else? Who am I on my own? Who am I when no one depends on me? Who am I when I can just be myself? And that is what the rebirth process is looking like now.
Thank you. And speaking of dovetailing into, the parts of this book that I read, there was so much kind of measured stock in this gorgeous book, in the significance and the tenacity of matrilineal love, of inheritances, of memory and how they're ordered and disordered. We've heard about how you feel about this incipient, charged moment of dealing with mortality and the passage of your mother, but I'd love you to speak about her briefly. Like who is she? There's another poet, Banu Kapiol, who wrote a book, The Interrogation of Strangers, and one of her questions that she provokes her audience with is, who is responsible for the suffering of your mother? Where do we begin to know the speaker in this book in relation to that question? And I have a few other questions, but let's start with those. Who is your mother?
So in a very literal sense, my mother is Lizet Flores. She was born in Brooklyn to two Cuban parents who left pre-revolution, right before things were getting very intense in Cuba. She comes from a working class background. Her father was a barber, but a guitarist, so a working class artist. And her mother was a seamstress, which I think is its own art. I come from a line of working class artists, and my mother's art was singing. So I grew up evangelical Christian, Assembly of God Pentecostal, which a lot of people are kind of surprised when they hear that. But I grew up in the church, and I grew up listening, bless you, to my mother singing constantly. We would be having conversations and she would just burst out into song. She was the living embodiment of a musical. And her voice was so powerful. She had a 5-octave range. So I grew up around this desire to be an artist, but I didn't sing like her. I don't carry a tune the way she did. But I would write constantly, and she encouraged it. So she never held back from fostering that art because she wanted to be a professional singer and never could. She didn't finish college. She went to art school, but really struggled. I think as a lot of working class people, especially women of color, can struggle in environments like that. And so she dropped out of college, became a secretary, and expressed her art through religion. But I think when she saw the talent within me and I had the grades and I was able to get scholarships and all of that, she fully encouraged it, even to the point where in my senior year at Florida State, that's when she was diagnosed with brain cancer. I was ready to just drop all of my acceptances to grad school. And I said, no, I'll just live in Miami, stay in the house, take care of you. And she said, absolutely not. You will go to NYU, you will get your master's, you will become a writer, and we'll figure it out from here. And so that's, I think, something I still grapple with. There's still a lot of guilt around that. But even my sister, talking to her, I'm very close with her, she also agrees that this is what my mother wanted. And so for my mom to see that I now work at an art school, I've published books, I host an open mic, I'm doing all the things that I always talked about wanting to do as a kid, I like to think that she would be really proud of that.
So pivoting from that rich matrilineal inheritance to the speaker, to you, where do we begin to know the speaker in this book? What kinds of knowledge inform us that aren't official? So I'm thinking about a lot of aspects in this book rely on kind of official knowledge, on official and unofficial knowledge, recipes, folklore. I'm just thinking about what you said about your religious upbringing and how that informs the composition of your book, but also spirituality, magicking, conjuring. If you could speak to any of that and how it informs, I guess, the speaker of this book.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because my maternal great-grandmother was a curandera. So that's sort of like a green witch or like a kitchen witch, I think, in like English terms. So I grew up with a mother who was very much like, let's pray over you, get the anointing oil, let's speak in tongues. And also, don't take medicine, you're going to drink this ginger root. I'm going to sing this song to you. Don't be barefoot in the house because you will get sick. Always wear your mal de ojo, that kind of thing, right? So I had this very strange like spiritualism that I grew up with, but also deeply rooted in Christianity. And those two things are always grappling. And so I have another poem where I kind of grapple with this in both English and Spanish, this concept of having multitudes. And particularly being a person of Caribbean descent, my ancestry is very mixed. I am Spanish, I am Taino, I am African, but at the same time, I present very white. And so all of those things are part of me. And I can't separate one from the other. And so there's this constant, I also like to think of myself as a very analytical and logical person, and yet I'm always drawn to these more esoteric practices and these rituals and just existing within all of it. Even my desire to write, I found out after my mother passed away that one of my great-grandfathers was a poet in Cuba, and I had no idea until I had a conversation with my grandmother about it. So it just feels like a lot of these things, like you say, are inherited. And the more I dive into my art, the more I'm able to discover who I am and who was there before me.
And that kind of naturally leads into this question that I'll just put a little more pressure on you in terms of that multiplicity that you mentioned. So much of this derives from these almost discordant, wide range of autobiographical experiences. And I see so many people in this voice: a daughter, a Floridian, a girl, a descendant, a shapeshifter. Vulnerability and grit and temerity and realness and performance are kind of squished side by side in really provocative ways. So how much to you, as a poet, as a creator, how much of survival relies on acknowledging and embracing a kind of vexed multiplicity? And related to that question, how do you grapple with Cuban roots in a complex place like the United States, like Florida and the United States? And how does this inform your approach to language in Invasive Species?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think specifically being Cuban and having family that came both pre and post revolution is very interesting. I think most Cuban Americans tend to be very conservative, and I was raised very conservative, but I no longer lean that way. I opened myself up to a lot of experiences that I think maybe generations past would have stayed away from, simply because fear of the unknown. And then at the same time, being a Caribbean person who now lives in Florida, this was happening thousands of years before the colonizers came to this side of the hemisphere. There are roots of Taino people living in Florida. So I feel like in many ways, I am just following the pattern that my ancestors have always followed, while also embarking on something new.
And speaking of place, there's a series of poems in your book, serial poems called Florida Gothic. And I was particularly drawn to these, and I have two questions related to this series, but also related to the book's orientation towards sequence and growth. And I read this as well in your chapbook. But one, how does a poetic sequence, or in other words, parts of a larger whole, speak to this book as a kind of personal, a catalog of personal growth or becoming, or maybe undoing and unbecoming? And two, can you speak to how Florida, a specifically Gothic version of Florida, perhaps at odds with this kind of sunshine state veneer, informs your work, but also in this book, but also in all of your poetry?
I think to the second question, when I first heard it, I immediately thought of my father's backyard. He has these two giant mango trees and a mamey tree, which is, it's almost like a papaya, but it has a giant seed in the middle. And so in the summertime, they'll just be so full of fruit, and it's beautiful, and you see all the different colors as the fruit ripen. But then when you look at the floor, it's just covered in rotten mush, because all of the fruit that keeps falling, and then all the bugs and squirrels and all the animals that get to it. And to me, that's what Florida Gothic means. It's this like direct connection between life and death, and this rotten underbelly that is both necessary, but at the same time, difficult to live with and process, right? So you got to clean up the mess, or utilize it in some way that'll be beneficial for the whole. But you can't have one without the other. And that's sort of my conceptualization of what Florida Gothic means, and all the complexities that come with living in this state. Because at this point, I've lived in almost every single part of it, and I've seen a lot of different sides of what this state
So
has. Speaking
speaking of this state, how many Floridas, so you spoke to one, but how many Floridas do you perceive there to be?
The limit does not exist.
And what draws you to, because I noticed this in your other work beyond your newest book, what draws you to the conflict of place in your poems? And relatedly, what's your favorite place in Florida, having lived all over the state?
Oh man, it's okay. Conflict of place. I don't know if you can be a child of immigrants and not have a conflict of place. I'm deeply rooted in being from Miami, but the Miami I'm from no longer exists. So that's something I think about a lot. It's been very gentrified, and it is almost untenable for working class people to live there. And at the same time, so much of who I am is from that place, which was like post 80s, pre-housing crisis Miami. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
Well, the fun one is, what's your favorite place
in
Florida? Having lived, in most parts of it.
So this is interesting because I feel like so many of my favorite places in Florida are very temporal. So it's not necessarily the location, but the time of year that I can visit it. For example, I think Miami in the summer is like disgusting because it is so humid. It is so hot and sticky, and I love that. I just want to sit outside, get covered in sweat, jump into the pool or jump into the ocean, and then like there's something about that constant cycle of like overheating and cooling off that it just feels like home to me. I also really love all the like kitschy festivals that happen around Florida. So for example, Gasparilla, if anyone's ever been, and like, just why are we dressed as pirates walking around the street? But yes, we should be, because this is Florida. So things like that are rooted in specific times of year, that are also tied to that place.
And this is a related question. So do you find that there are features of your writing that feel particularly tethered to your cultural perspective and or orientation, specifically living, thriving in the U.S. South?
Yes. I think this is tied to the fact that I have all the credentials of someone who should be sort of like a, look at me, I'm fancy academic lady with an MFA, and yet my dad was a construction worker. So those two things exist at the same time for me. I have to explain to my dad like what poems are. He still doesn't really get it. And yet Cuba has a very rich history with poetry. Even in cigar factories, there was someone's job it was to read poetry to the cigar rollers, essentially. And Jose Marti was like a founding father. He's a Cuban national poet. So it is really interesting to me to like exist within these two worlds of like very high art, having the like academic background. But then I think there's also like a poetry to Cuban Spanish specifically, because it's very different from other kinds of Spanish. The accent is different. The phrases are very different. And that's something I do love about Spanish in Latin America, is like every country has its own spin on it. It's almost like we're making fun of the language in our own way. And so I feel like I do that, but now with English. And I apply a lot of Spanish syntax into English. And I also like to blend languages together.
So thinking about language in that way as a kind of invasiveness.
Yes.
I love the title of this book, Invasive Species, for the multiple meanings imbued in the negative, very negative connotations, right, of something being invasive. For me, in that title, there's almost like this redress of the colonial gaze and taking back who invaded who in the context of your book's voice. And in thinking about that, I wonder if you can describe how you arrived at this title. Were there other titles you were considering? Are you an invasive species? What and where are the values that are being threatened and being invaded? And what do you think about the invasive Cuban tree frog in Florida?
So the title came from the fact that I noticed a motif in many of my poems. I talk about cane toads a lot. And cane toads are an invasive species to Florida. In South Florida, they're everywhere, and they're these massive toads. They're big and lumpy and brown. And I have vivid memories of my dad taking me to the backyard and teaching me how to like hunt them and kill them. And so it's this very like violent action we're doing. And as an adult now, I'm thinking, I mean, they didn't ask to be here, but here I am with my bucket of salt. Like, all right, let's go find some cane toads and get rid of them, you know? And so that's where the title came from, was just thinking about the cane toad motif. As an adult now, I understand why invasive species are problematic, but at the same time, I do feel like I have a soft spot for invasive species. And I think it is, an offshoot of colonialism, right? And this idea of like bringing things over, not really thinking through consequences, and then the fallout just happening, and grappling with that.
And you said, you mentioned earlier that Mother City was on the cutting floor. Any other titles that you circled through, potential titles?
Honestly, no, because I think it went from Mother City, and then I put together Cuentos from the Swamp and Memoria. And then once I reworked a lot of poems and added in a lot of poems, that's like invasive species just kind of came to me after I noticed how many incorporated different examples of invasive species.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Also in invasive species, there are these really interesting multiple reorientations of space and time through a reclamation of a specifically Latina perspective. So I'm interested related in writers like, and I think this is, this really dovetails with what we've been talking about in terms of the colonial gaze, et cetera. But I'm thinking about the writer Matthew Salasas and his book Craft in the Real World, who have only very recently called really important attention to the problematic standards of shaping craft, poetic craft, fiction craft, creative craft, via dominant standards that often unconsciously prioritize a white-centric view of how we evaluate, shape, and edit the literary arts based on specific institutional standards. I've thought about this question a lot in terms of how writers approach their craft, their subjects, their voice in their work, and I've thought about it a lot in terms of your book and what you're doing. So in what ways does your cultural heritage inform not only what you write about, but how you write about it? And, you know, you mentioned your MFA in poetry from NYU, but you also herald this really beautiful bottom-up, vital local open mic series that cultivates poetry as a really open, accessible space to all. So what was your experience learning? That's a lot of questions, but you know, I think about this constantly. What was your experience learning about poetry in and out of official institutions? Where does poetry live in your mind?
For me, poetry has to be the confrontation of language. I think about Cuban Spanish a lot because it is denigrated by a lot of Latin American and Spanish-speaking communities because, and people might or might not realize this consciously, there is a huge African influence in Cuban Spanish. And so a lot of times the language is looked down upon because it has been racialized in a way that other forms of Spanish have not. The way we speak, we clip our our S's at the end of words. That a lot of that comes from Yoruba, which is a West African language. There are words in Yoruba that we still use to this day. There are words in Taíno that we still use to this day. And this happens with Dominican Spanish as well as Puerto Rican Spanish. So this is sort of a Caribbean difference compared to other South American languages that maybe have the more standardized Spain Spanish forms, right? And so that's something I think about a lot, is just what makes Caribbean Spanish, especially Cuban Spanish, so different. And then I also think about like Southern traditions. And in the US, Southern culture is oftentimes directly influenced by African culture, right? And so looking at the similarities of that, I think that's where a lot of my exploration happens.
And how was your experience at NYU? How much of that did sort of, how much of that informs or not how you approached writing, and also coming back to Florida after spending some time in New York? Can you speak to that experience?
Yeah, it was hard. It was, I went to public school and I was always the smart girl in class. And then I went to NYU. Everyone's the smart girl in class, and they've got rich parents that can help them live in Brooklyn and Williamsburg and, pay their rent. And I'm here like, all right, maybe if I get my work study plus go, volunteer at this food bank and take some cans of beans home, like I'll get through this month. And so I just feel like there was a level of survival I was doing that a lot of my classmates did not have to consider, which was challenging. And yet my thesis advisor was Yusuf Komunyakaa, who completely revolutionized my idea of what poetry is. My first workshop was with Sharon Olds. So I just feel so privileged that I got to work with these giants in poetry. But I definitely felt like a fish out of water. And I was also pretty young. I was, I think, 22 when I was getting my MFA. So I just felt like way behind in terms of life experience, in terms of writing experience, in terms of knowledge. I was also at that point still very sheltered. So they were just like experiences. I had never dated anyone. I'd never fallen in love. I'd lived on my own at that point, but because I was still in Florida, I would go home a lot to the weekend. So this was the first time where I couldn't really be around my family. And it was just a sort of breaking open of self that was more than just learning. It was just like re-experiencing life.
And I'm going to push you on the question, where do you think poetry lives? Like, does it live on the bottom of our shoes? Does it live in these books? Like, does it live on the stage? Where in all of your varied experience would you consider poetry most living for you?
My hands. I think I talk a lot with my hands. I think that's a very Latin thing to do. I write, like physically write a lot, or I type. And the way that I interact with people when I'm deeply in love, I tend to be like very physical, right? So it's just sort of all these things where I think poetry is in my hands. And from that, it can be a metaphor for creation, and it can also just be the actual act of writing. It's mothering, it's loving, it's all those things.
So you spoke about a few mentors, but who has been some of the biggest influences on your poetry in terms of other poets or other art forms? And relatedly, maybe what excites you about poetry today? Like, who have you been reading lately? I'd love to know what's sparking you.
If I'm gonna go old school, Charles Baudelaire. I love a sad little French guy. So I found his book in a little lending library, The Flowers of Evil. And that was just, again, because my sense of poetry was like very, traditional English class poetry. I'd never read anything like it before. Nazim Hikmet is another one. I love how stark and like, he doesn't say a lot, yet you know exactly what he's saying in his poems. And I love that sparseness of language. I think I struggle with that, so I try to aim for that. In terms of modern poets, there's Alan Peláez López, who's a non-binary Afro-Mexican poet that does really interesting work with visual art and poetry. I am very interested in this. I have a side project with my partner where we like run around Florida and take pictures, and I write poems, and I also try to take pictures now. So I'm very interested in these sort of imagery of poetry and how it's in many ways closer to visual art than it is maybe like a traditional narrative. And then I also just read Nicole Seeley's The Ferguson Report. And so also thinking about using other works as sort of basis for my poetry, erasure poetry. And so those are the ones that really stick out to me right now.
That's really exciting. So I know you're on the heels of just having published your first full-length book, but what are you actively working on right now? Are you working on another book? What's the next steps? I know you're doing a million things.
I am working on another book. I'm scared of this one, which I think means I'm doing something right, because it is invasive species is personal in the way talking about yourself to another person is personal. The next book I'm working on is me being honest to myself, about myself, to everyone I'm talking to. And I think that's a very different thing. It's a lot about love and relationships, which I think maybe it's been overdone, but it scares me because I was a late bloomer, and like romance is something that has always challenged me in a lot of ways. And so I'm still grappling with what this project is, but yeah, there's a lot of pieces coming, and I'm scared of it, but it's coming out and I can't stop it. So I've stopped fighting it and I'm just embracing it, and we'll see where it takes us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could perhaps close us out with reading maybe one or two final poems, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions. So if you have any kind of percolating, we'll turn it over to you in just a moment. So maybe think about what you'd like to ask Michelle. But yeah, if you could grace us with a couple of more poems, and then we'll turn over to the audience.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote while at NYU. And I think this was the first time I'd written a poem where I wowed myself, because I was being so honest. I had never written so directly about personal experience until I wrote this poem. So this is God Moves in Mysterious Ways. I knelt for my mother at the altar. I was not greedy, never asked for a miracle. I just wanted God to give her strength and rest. 4 days later, she had a stroke. I used to tell myself evil was not God's fault. Bad things happen. All we can do is move on. Knowing this does not make it hurt any less. Now I wonder if I have ever believed. There's a hole in my chest no spirit could fill. My mother has been dying for 1.5 years now. She's lost in her own eyes. She hears bells I wish I could, a ringing that keeps her awake, praying. All I can hear her repeat is, "Oh Lord, my Father," and I can't help but wonder if he's purposefully ignoring her. Children should bury their parents. That is the order of things. Knowing this does not make the digging any easier. I'm gonna read one more, a happy one, because that was that's kind of a downer. I like it, but it's a downer. Okay. Let's see. Thank you for being patient while I look for these. If you don't mind, I'm going to grab my phone really quick because I know it's on my phone. This one's actually going to be a silly one. So in Miami, we have this term for like, it's sort of like the East Coast Caribbean version of a chola. It's called a chonga. So think kind of what I'm wearing, but maybe with like a really high ponytail and like thin eyebrows, right? So this is called Ode to a Chonga. I saw you at Flanagan's standing near the bar, waiting for your friends, and I thought, dale mama, with your crunchy curly hair down to the middle of your back, with your pursed lips dripping Spanglish to anyone who'll listen, y sus uñas de acrylic fingering the hoop earrings your arms could fit through. I could see the Guajira in your eyes, the way they were filled with los rayos de lumbre pura, and the beauty Jose Martí depicted. So I want to holla at you, throwing down some versos sencillos. And as we stood near the end of the bar, your hips dipped to the merengue in the background. I caught you staring at my scars the way I stared at those perfect labios. As you talked Martí, your hands moved like a lavadora, weaving that Santeria before I knew what hit me. I asked about the name on your breast, and when you said it was in memory of your papa, I knew the sunrises spent building condos for the gringos were worth it.
Thank you.
So we are going to go ahead and open it up to questions. So if you have any, please do write them down. And for our Zoom audience, if you have any, do send them through the Q&A chat. But we did have some early birds, so I already have a couple to hand to Jessica.
We got a good stack.
All right.
Sorry, I'm just trying to interpret the handwriting. Florida Gothic, what was... Does most of your poetry just come out, something you can't stop? Okay, Florida Gothic, what was something you used as an example of it? Does most of your poetry just come out, something you can't stop? There's just one word I can't read, sorry.
Thank you. So, an example to me of Florida Gothic, kind of like the imagery, like the third Florida Gothic poem I ever wrote was that experience of laying down in my dad's backyard while like guavas riding around me. But then I'm looking at these beautiful bougainvillea bushes in my dad's backyard. And then a bunch of cane toads start coming out. So that's the whole thing. Another one is a poem I wrote about the first time I like learned how to kill a cane toad from my father. And so it's a lot of that kind of imagery of just this like very balanced view of life and death. In terms of how my poems come, it depends. Sometimes they come out fully formed and then I just got to edit them. Sometimes I have to trick my brain into writing because otherwise I think I lose that muscle. So when that happens, I tend to go to received forms. So I'll write villanelles or I'll write sonnets or really bad sestinas. I haven't mastered that form yet, but that's sort of what I do in terms of figuring out my process. I try to do a combination of received forms and then just letting inspiration strike.
So this one is actually kind of related to that. You mentioned erasure poetry in passing. Could you say a little more about it?
Yeah. Erasure poetry, you can also describe it as blackout poetry. It's where you take a text that has already been written and then you can either circle words that stand out to you while you're reading it or black out specific words and just let certain words shine through. But the main goal with it is to sort of find the imagery within a narrative. Oftentimes prose texts are used, although I've done this with song lyrics. And so it's really just about, I think, again, playing with language, playing around with imagery, and finding something new within something that's already been written.
Next question. What do you feel is the purpose of your poetry, both for you while you're writing it and for your audience once it is out in the world?
I don't know what the purpose is. I poem because I am. I don't know. That's sort of how I think about it. It's just part of who I am, and I've been writing since I could write. So that's just part of me. I think for my audience, I just want people to have a different perspective on what Florida is like. I think a lot of the perspectives we have are very limited and do speak to the absurdities of Florida, but I think also glance over the beauty. And there's a lot of absurdity here. There's a lot of pain here, but there's a lot of beauty. And I like to live within all of those spaces.
When you started writing poetry again after 5 years away from it, how did you know when it was ready to be published? And I have a similar question. How did you know that Invasive Species was finally finished?
I think being finished and being ready to be published are two different things. Mm-hmm. I never know when my work is ready to be published, but I know when I'm done working with it. Invasive Species took about 4 years to fully come into what it is now. But I could tell from the beginning that it wasn't fully done. I'm the kind of person who's very much like, I'm just going to figure it out. So I just sent it off. I do the same thing with publishing. I make sure I always edit my poems, and I make sure like a couple of eyes have seen them before I start submissions. But I also try to make sure that I don't get into sort of a perfectionist habit and limit myself because I'm too scared. Once I feel like I'm done with it, then I'm ready to send it off. There are some things where I might feel like I'm done with it, but I'm not ready for anyone to see it either. So those will stay close to my chest until I'm ready to send them off to get published.
Next question. Hurricane Andrew, 1992, impacted South Florida. Did that influence your perspective on Florida or hurricanes?
Yes. I'm a big fan of the hurricane party. So next time there's a hurricane, come find me. I will be drinking whiskey on my porch. I was like 4 or 5 when that happened, and our roof almost got torn off our house. There were power lines all over my neighborhood, and my dad was like, hey, let's run around the neighborhood and throw buckets of water at each other. This seems very safe. So I'm very cavalier to a fault about hurricanes, and I probably should be a little bit more safe. But again, this is the Florida Gothicness of it all, right? You face death, and then you have a little drink and keep it moving. So.
And speaking of which, what has been the most surprising or unexpected source of inspiration for your work?
Food and cooking. I am not very good at cooking, but I have several poems that center food. I also am married to a chef, so maybe there's something to that. But yeah. And I think it's because food is so tied to culture. And most of my food poems tend to be around cultural foods.
Thank you. Can you tell us more about your open mic project? And is there a separate podcast? What made you start the project, the open mic project, and who participates in it? Students, ? Others?
Yes. So the open mic is at Rain Dogs, which is in 5 Points. It's every Monday from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock p.m. We allow anyone over 18 to come on by. We don't care if you have formal training, if you've never written a poem in your life, if you are more of a prose writer, as long as you stay within your 5 minutes and have something fun to write and fun to share, we welcome everyone to that space. What we have done more recently is we are in the process of publishing a series of zines. So, getting circulation of different work of local poets, local artists out there into the world is really important to us. We also love having themed shows because we like to push our poets to work on craft and to really think about what you're writing and be really intentional with it. I think that's what makes it the difference between reading your diary out loud and reading art is the intention. And so we push our audience to think about form. We'll have our winter formal where, you have to come in and bring like a sonnet or an ode or something like that. We will do specific topics. Like over the summer, we had like a Palestine themed show. We've done things for holidays as well. So we really try to run the gamut of how can we push our audience to think about writing things in different ways, and we also work on performance. I think that's a big part of poetry that gets lost. It started as an oral art form. It should be performed. It should be shared out loud. And we really try to embrace that aspect of the community.
So this is a related question. What advice would you give to those who would like to write and publish?
Write a lot. Recognize that not everything you write is good. So some things will have to be rewritten. Some things will have to be changed. Find a good community you can trust to give you the advice on how to do that. Because I think sometimes just relying on ourselves, we might miss certain things, might miss certain perspectives. And then publishing is hard. So find people that you can trust who can help you guide you through that process. But I think that's the main thing is like locking into a good community of people that you can rely on to help you with the editing process, the revising process, makes publishing a lot easier.
Thank you. I feel like this next question is almost in a form of a poem. Do you have any other family, sister, to help, grandmother, caretake? People, who are they? Where did they come from? Culture, religion?
Okay. I mean, I do have a sister. I have a younger sister. She's not artistic at all. So we have like very different views on life because of that. She was the caretaker for my mother when I was away at grad school. My grandmother is still alive. Actually, both of my grandmothers are still alive. Yeah, I'm still very connected to my family, which can be challenging at times. I think especially as an artist, it can be challenging to be true to yourself and also deeply connected to your family, but it is a big part of who I am. And so I think that's why a lot of my work centers my family, and a lot of my life does as well.
Looks like we have another question.
Mm-hmm.
No?
Okay.
Okay. I have one last question to close us out.
Sure.
So thinking about the title of your chap, Cuentos from the Swamp, thinking about the swamp as like an artistic feature, but also as a place-derived feature of Florida, but the U.S. South as well. Like, how do you approach the swamp? Like, what is the swamp? What is the concept of the swamp? It's so much in your work, and I'd love to close us out in thinking about and bringing us to this specific place.
So the swamp in my work is the Everglades, and I think the Everglades is a metaphor for my mind. There's a lot of things happening up here, and I have a lot of really vivid memories, everything from airboat rides. You hear all the stories of the giant pythons that live in the swamp, the invasive species, right? I have memories of, this is a very Florida thing, going with a bunch of friends when I was in high school or college, getting a bunch of old Christmas trees from Home Depot post-Christmas, driving out to the Everglades, burning a bunch of Christmas trees, drinking beer outside of our trucks, like very Florida moment, right? So that's sort of what the swamp is for me. It's just like the messiness, the chaos, but the beauty and fun and camaraderie. And that is like a bigger representation of Florida.
Thank you so much, Michelle.